Hello and welcome back to Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today is part 4 of my biographical sketch of Major General George B. McClellan. When we last left off, the Union Army was handed yet another defeat at Bull Run. And much like after the Battle of First Bull Run, a demoralized Union Army came into Washington. McClellan was not present at Second Bull Run. He was in Washington, D.C. and could only hear the battle in the distance. But unlike First Bull Run, the Confederate Army did not stay stationary at Manassas. Bobby Lee put it in motion and headed towards Maryland. He was hoping to achieve a victory on Northern soil. With a demoralized army and a demoralized nation, Lincoln held a special cabinet meeting and decided there was only one person, one man, that could whip the army back into shape and get them ready to fight almost immediately. That man was Major General George B. McClellan. Most of Lincoln's cabinet objected to putting McClellan back at the top spot, but Lincoln said, "We must work with the tools that we have," and Mac was truly back for his second and final tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And he set his army in motion into Maryland. Then he had a rare stroke of luck, something that rarely ever happens to an army commander. One of the men in the Army of the Potomac found Robert E. Lee's Special Order 191, destined for Confederate General D.H. Hill. This order, Special Order 191, informed McClellan of where all of the Confederate divisions were located. And McClellan moved with uncharacteristic speed, but still rather slowly. This Maryland campaign, as it's known, would culminate at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. I'm standing in front of the Pry House located here at Antietam National Battlefield. As you can see, it's currently undergoing some preservation work. McClellan utilized the Pry House as his field headquarters both during and for a few days after the Battle of Antietam. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things I admire most about McClellan is the fact that he promised to write or telegraph his wife every day that they were apart during the war, a promise that he kept. Even as the Battle of Antietam was raging around him, he sat down to write his wife a brief letter. To Mary Ellen McClellan, we are in the midst of the most terrible battle of the age. So far God has given us success, but with many variations during the day. The battle is not yet over, and I write this in the midst of it. I trust God will smile upon our cause. I am well, none of your immediate friends killed that I hear of. Your father, with me, quite safe. G.B. McClellan, M.G.C., short for Major General Commanding. I'm standing alongside Burnside's Bridge here at Antietam National Military Park. Once a sign of death and destruction, it is now probably one of the most peaceful spots on the battlefield. At the time of the battle, it was known simply as Roebuck's Bridge, but because it took Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps almost the entire day just to cross this bridge, it has forever been known now by his name. The Battle of Antietam was a one-day battle, September 17th, 1862. And when you add up the casualties between both North and South, when you look at the total number of men killed, wounded, taken prisoner, and those unfortunates forever listed among the missing, no other day in American military history surpasses the Battle of Antietam. On September 18th, the two sides basically faced each other off across the Antietam Creek. Pickets exchanged a few gunfire, but the battle was not renewed. On September 18th, General Lee's entire Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac back into the safety of Virginia. McClellan basically let them go unmolested. In early October, 2 to 3 weeks after the battle was over, Abraham Lincoln paid a visit here to Sharpsburg. His purpose for coming here was basically twofold. One was to get a sense of the morale of the troops serving in the Army of the Potomac, get a sense of their fighting spirit. And it was also to try to prod his little general into finally taking some action and moving across their namesake river back into Virginia and to give battle to Robert E. Lee again. But McClellan did what he did a year earlier when he was first building the Army of the Potomac. He did not move his army until he felt that they were refit, resupplied, retrained, and ready to go. Once the midterm elections were over in early November of 1862, Lincoln decided that he had no more use for his little general, and it was time to relieve McClellan for a second and what would turn out to be a final time. When McClellan bade farewell to his troops, men were literally crying, weeping at the thought of losing their beloved general. But McClellan told them that orders are orders and they must be obeyed. And now he was asking them to obey their new commander, Ambrose Burnside. McClellan vowed that he would return should there ever be a third Bull Run, but that would never happen. Although, during the Gettysburg campaign, as the Union Army was moving across the Mason-Dixon line heading north, rumor went around that McClellan actually had been restored to power, and cheers went out through the Union ranks. Cheers of "Mac is back" could be heard, but it was not to be. When McClellan ran for president in 1864 on the Democratic ticket against Abraham Lincoln, campaigns back then were not like they are now in the 21st century. McClellan did very little campaigning on his own, but he did have these bronze statues made up that he handed out to prominent supporters. The statue depicts McClellan as a general atop of his favorite warhorse, Dan Webster. He also had some campaign posters made up, and I have reproductions of them here. These are also part of my shrine to McClellan in my home. The first one, on the left, tells what would happen if you elect Lincoln. As it states, elect Lincoln and the black Republican ticket, and you will bring on Negro equality, more debt, harder times, another draft, universal anarchy, and ultimate ruin. But if you elect McClellan and the whole Democratic ticket, you will defeat Negro equality, restore prosperity, reestablish the Union in an honorable, permanent, and happy peace. As I mentioned in the introduction, McClellan was defeated badly in the election of 1864. During the American Civil War, it was not uncommon for generals, and particularly army commanders, to have several horses at their disposal, and it was also not uncommon for them to favor one horse over the other. Robert E. Lee had several horses at his disposal, and his favorite was Traveler. George McClellan was no exception. He also had several horses at his disposal, but his favorite was Dan Webster. Dan Webster was a black horse who stood 17 hands high, the same height as its rider, and the two must have made a grand spectacle whenever they appeared on the scene. McClellan loved Dan, and he did not exclude a passage about Dan Webster in his memoirs. Here, a page from McClellan's own story, we see McClellan holding an unsaddled Dan Webster next to a Civil War cannon. And McClellan had this to say about his favorite war horse, quote, "Dan and I never quarreled, and the dear old fellow survived the war for many years, dying at a ripe old age in 1879. No matter how long we might be parted, once for nearly 4 years, he always recognized me the moment we met again, and in his own way showed his pleasure at seeing me. Even on the day of his death, which was a painless one from old age, whenever I entered his stall, he tried to rise and greet me, but unable to do that, he would lean his head against me and lick my hand. No soldier ever had a more faithful or better horse than I had in Dan Webster." End quote. McClellan would not be in the United States at the time the Civil War came to an end. He would be overseas in Europe. After the American Civil War was over, he was elected as governor of New Jersey for one term, where his most proudest accomplishment was to upgrade, update, and modernize the New Jersey militia. He would have two children, his daughter Mary, or May, who was born at the very start of the Civil War, and a son, George Jr., who would go on to become mayor of New York City. In the summer of 1885, McClellan began to experience chest pains, and on October 29th, 1885, just a few weeks before his 59th birthday, McClellan died of what appears to have been an apparent heart attack. This really does conclude my biographical sketch of George McClellan. I'm not sure if I made any converts over to those who are on the fence or did not like McClellan before the start of this video, but to me, he is the most fascinating general of the American Civil War, thus making him the general that I like to read about most, and thus making him my favorite Civil War general. Until next time, this is Brian Thomas Kopak for Civil War Reports. And if you would like to read up more about this topic, the primary sources I used to bring this episode to you were George B. McClellan, The Young Napoleon by Stephen Sears, George B. McClellan, The Man Who Saved the Union by Eckenrode and Conrad, The Civil War Papers of George B. McClellan, also by Stephen Sears, George B. McClellan, The Disposable Patriot by Michael J. McHugh, and McClellan's own memoirs entitled McClellan's Own Story, which was published after his death. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button, give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends, let them know about this channel, and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.